It was a warm afternoon in the busy city of Atlanta. FBI Special Agent Nina Harris, a brilliant and highly respected black woman, was driving back to her office after completing an intense investigation. For months, she had been tracking down a dangerous drug cartel, and she was close to making a breakthrough. The exhaustion from the long hours weighed on her, but so did the sense of pride in the work she was doing. As one of the few black women in a predominantly white, male-dominated agency, Nina had faced her share of challenges, but she had earned her place with hard work, intelligence, and resilience. The pressure was immense, yet her determination never faltered. This case meant everything. It was her chance to bring down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. Nina's mind raced with the details of the case as she navigated through the bustling streets. She was replaying the latest intel in her head when suddenly, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Confused, Nina glanced down at the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. What could she have possibly done wrong? Pulling over to the side of the road, her heart began to race, not out of fear of what she had done, but out of the sinking feeling that this could be something far more sinister. She had experienced her fair share of difficult encounters before, but something about this situation felt different. A police car pulled up behind her, and a tall white officer with a stern expression stepped out. Officer Grant, his name badge read. As he slowly walked toward her window, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, Nina kept calm, rolling down her window. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Nina asked politely, ready to flash her FBI badge if necessary. Grant barely looked at her before barking, "License and registration." Nina blinked, taken aback by his tone. This wasn't the usual protocol she expected, but she remained professional. Reaching for her badge, she calmly said, "I'm an FBI agent. Here's my badge." She held it out for him to see. Grant gave it a brief glance, his eyes narrowing. "I said license and registration," he repeated coldly, his voice even harsher. Nina's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. She had encountered difficult cops before, but this felt different. His dismissive attitude toward her authority sent a chill down her spine. "Officer, I'm a federal agent. I'm on official duty," she reiterated, her tone calm but firm. She needed to defuse the situation before it escalated any further. But Grant wasn't interested in what she had to say. His eyes were sharp, his expression cold and unyielding. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered sharply. Nina stared at him, shocked by the sudden escalation. She knew her rights, and she knew this was wrong. There was no valid reason for her to be pulled over, let alone asked to exit the car, but the tension was thick, and the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. "I'm complying with your request, but I need you to understand that I am an FBI agent," she repeated, her voice steady, though inside her frustration was growing. Grant leaned closer to her window, his face twisted with disdain. "I don't care if you're the president. Step out of the vehicle, or I'll drag you out myself." Nina's stomach knotted. She slowly opened her door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. People passing by were starting to stare, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. But no one intervened. Without warning, Grant grabbed her roughly by the arm and shoved her against the car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Nina protested, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "Resisting arrest, huh?" Grant sneered as he twisted her arm behind her back. "You think you can just flash a badge and do whatever you want, don't you?" Nina winced as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She couldn't believe what was happening. This was beyond humiliating. It was an outright abuse of power. As a federal agent, she had the authority to deal with cases far more complex and dangerous than a traffic stop. Yet here she was, being treated like a common criminal. And she knew exactly why. Because Officer Grant saw her as a black woman first, not as a respected FBI agent. People were watching, some openly staring, others whispering amongst themselves. A few phones were still recording the scene, but no one spoke up. No one challenged the officer's actions. Nina's face burned with a mix of anger and embarrassment, but she held her head high. She wasn't going to let this man break her spirit. "Officer Grant, you're making a mistake," Nina said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly from the anger boiling inside her. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Shut your mouth," he snapped. "You think you're better than everyone else just because you work for the FBI? Well, let me tell you something, you're not above the law." Nina's mind raced. She had to stay calm, but she also needed to figure out how to get out of this situation without making it worse. Her colleagues at the FBI would never believe this if she told them. Arrested for no reason while on duty. How could this be happening? Grant dragged her toward his patrol car, ignoring her every attempt to reason with him. As he shoved her into the back seat, Nina caught a glimpse of the people filming. Some of them looked shocked, murmuring in disbelief, but no one stepped forward to help. As the door slammed shut, Nina took a deep breath. She had been through many tough situations in her career, but this felt different. This felt personal. Grant had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't let him get away with it. Her mind started working quickly. Would she call for backup? Would she file a formal complaint? She couldn't afford to lose her temper. Not now. But she also couldn't let this injustice go unanswered. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Nina's thoughts raced. This was far from over. The air inside the police car was thick with tension as they drove away from the scene. The familiar hum of the city outside the window felt distant now, as if it belonged to a different world. Nina's wrists throbbed from the tight handcuffs, and she shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. Her mind raced, thinking of every possible scenario. How could this have escalated so quickly? And how far was Officer Grant willing to take this? She considered calling for help, but without her phone, which Grant had taken, she was isolated. No backup, no communication. A part of her wanted to scream, to let out the frustration that was building inside. But she knew better. Screaming wouldn't help now. She had to stay composed, had to think of a way to turn the situation in her favor. Nina had faced difficult situations in her career, but this was different. This wasn't just about her as an FBI agent. It was about her identity. Grant wasn't seeing an agent of the law. He was seeing a black woman, someone he thought he could belittle and intimidate. The car suddenly slowed down as they pulled into a small, run-down precinct on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the usual precinct she knew from previous cases. This one seemed older, less used. Her heart sank as she realized why. Grant had taken her somewhere away from the main precinct, likely to avoid any attention from his superiors or her FBI colleagues. As the car came to a stop, Grant turned around, his eyes cold. "Get out," he ordered. Nina complied, carefully stepping out of the car, her hands still cuffed behind her back. The few officers she saw inside barely glanced in her direction as Grant led her through the small, dimly lit station. The lack of reaction from his colleagues was chilling. It was as if this kind of behavior from Grant was normal, expected even. She was shoved into a small interrogation room, the door slamming shut behind her. The room was dim, with only a small metal table and 2 chairs. Grant pushed her roughly into one of the chairs, leaving the handcuffs on. He began pacing back and forth in front of her. "I don't care who you say you are," Grant snarled, his voice low and threatening. "As far as I'm concerned, you're just another criminal trying to pull a fast one." Nina met his gaze, unflinching. "You're violating my rights. You have no reason to hold me, and when this is over, you'll regret it." Grant stopped pacing, leaning in close to her face, his breath hot with contempt. "Is that a threat, Agent?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. Nina didn't blink. "It's a promise." Nina Harris wasn't just any FBI agent. She was one of the few black women in her field, a pioneer who had fought for every inch of respect she earned. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Nina had learned from a young age what it meant to be underestimated. She'd watched her mother navigate systemic racism in her job as a nurse and had seen her father, a retired soldier, wrestle with the mental scars left by years of service. These experiences shaped Nina, hardening her resolve to prove that she could rise above the limitations society placed on her. Becoming an FBI agent had been her dream, but it hadn't come without sacrifice. Nina had faced bias at every level, from her initial interviews to her assignments, where she was often the only woman, and certainly the only black woman, in a room full of white men. But she had persevered. Every case she solved, every promotion she earned, was a testament to her tenacity and intelligence. She had proven time and time again that she could handle anything the job threw at her. That day, as she drove through Atlanta, she wasn't just thinking about the drug cartel case that had consumed her life for months. She was thinking about the struggles of her career, the sacrifices she'd made, how hard it had been to break through a system that wasn't built for people like her. So when she saw the flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror, her first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't broken any laws. And yet here she was, being pulled over. Again. As Officer Grant approached her car, Nina couldn't help but feel a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She'd been here before, dealing with officers who treated her differently because of the color of her skin. But this time was different. She was an FBI agent, and she had every right to be on this road. Nina's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as Grant barked at her to hand over her license and registration. The tone in his voice was unmistakable. He had already made up his mind about her. But she wouldn't let him intimidate her, not this time. She reached for her badge, her voice calm and controlled as she explained who she was. But as Grant's dismissive eyes flicked over her credentials, that knot in her stomach twisted tighter. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about power. Nina sat in the small interrogation room, the cold metal cuffs biting into her wrists. The room was poorly lit, the only light source being the flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the bare walls. She could hear the faint sounds of police chatter outside the room, but no one came to check on her. This wasn't the first time Nina had faced discrimination or disrespect. Being a black woman in law enforcement came with its challenges, but nothing like this. She had faced her share of sexist and racist remarks throughout her career, but today was different. This wasn't just a passing comment or subtle ignorance. This was a full-blown violation of her rights, a blatant abuse of power. The door suddenly creaked open, and Officer Grant stepped back inside. His smug expression hadn't left his face. He sat down across from Nina, resting his hands on the table between them, eyes gleaming with arrogance. "So, Special Agent, huh?" Grant said, leaning back in his chair. "I've heard about women like you, thinking you're special because of a badge. Let me tell you something, you're not special, not here." Nina's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice firm. "I'm a federal agent, and you know it. You're violating protocol, and you will be held accountable." Grant smirked. "Is that so? You think you can walk into my town and throw your weight around just because you work for the feds? Not here. This is my territory, and you're nothing but a civilian with a fancy badge." Nina clenched her jaw. Every word he spoke was dripping with condescension. It wasn't just about her being an FBI agent. It was about her race, her gender. Grant wasn't just trying to humiliate her professionally. This was personal. "I demand to speak with my supervisor," Nina said, her voice steady, though her pulse quickened with every passing second. She knew her rights, and she wasn't going to let him take advantage of the situation any longer. Grant chuckled darkly. "You think anyone's going to come to your rescue, Agent Harris? You're in my precinct now. You don't have any power here." Nina narrowed her eyes, her mind working fast. She had to get out of this room, get to someone who would listen, someone who wasn't under Grant's thumb. The tension in the air was thick, and the situation felt as though it was spiraling out of control. She had been trained for high-stress situations, but nothing had prepared her for this, a racially charged abuse of power. Before she could say another word, the door opened again. This time, a younger officer, Officer Blake, stepped inside. He looked nervous, his eyes darting between Nina and Grant. He seemed out of place, unsure of what was going on. "Officer Blake, I need you to process our guest here," Grant said, the sneer in his voice unmistakable. Blake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Sir, are you sure this is the right procedure? She says she's an FBI agent. Maybe we should—" Grant slammed his fist on the table, cutting him off. "I don't care what she says. You do as I say, or you'll be joining her in that cell. Got it?" Blake flinched but nodded, clearly too afraid to argue further. He glanced at Nina, his expression a mix of guilt and reluctance, but he remained silent as he pulled out a notepad. "Name?" Blake asked quietly, avoiding eye contact with Nina. Nina knew she had to tread carefully. Blake seemed conflicted, maybe even sympathetic. She had to reach him, somehow make him see the injustice of the situation. "You already know who I am," Nina said, her voice calm but firm. "You know this isn't right. Officer Blake, do you really want to be part of this? You don't have to follow orders that are clearly wrong." Blake's hand froze mid-scribble, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, guilt, maybe even shame, but it was quickly masked by the fear of disobeying his superior. "I don't make the rules," Blake muttered, looking down at his notepad. "You might not make the rules," Nina said, leaning forward slightly, "but you can decide whether or not to follow them." Blake shifted uncomfortably, his pen trembling in his hand. The tension in the room was palpable, and Nina could see the conflict playing out on his face. He knew this was wrong, but he was too afraid to challenge Grant. And who could blame him? People like Grant held power over those beneath them, power that could make or break careers. Before Blake could respond, the door swung open again, and Grant stormed back in. His face was flushed with anger. "What's taking so long?" he barked, glaring at Blake. "She's a simple perp, not a puzzle to solve." Blake jumped up from his chair, stammering, I was just getting the basic information, sir." Grant sneered at him, clearly unimpressed. "Get her into holding already. We don't have all day." Blake nodded quickly, stuffing his notepad back into his pocket. He avoided looking at Nina as he stood up and motioned for her to follow him. But Nina wasn't done yet. She knew this might be her only chance to get through to Blake. "You're making a mistake, Officer Grant," Nina said, her voice steady and authoritative. "This is going to come back on you, I guarantee it." Grant laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart. But in this town, nobody cares about your so-called authority. You think just because you have a fancy FBI badge, that makes you untouchable? Think again." Nina held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not here to impress you, Officer Grant. I'm here to do my job. And trust me, the people who do care will be coming for you." For a moment, something flickered in Grant's eyes, a brief flash of uncertainty, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual smug arrogance. "We'll see about that," he muttered, before turning on his heel and leaving the room. Blake led Nina down a narrow hallway toward the holding cells, the tension between them thick. She could sense that Blake was still struggling with what had just happened, but he remained silent. They reached the small holding cell at the end of the hallway, and Blake unlocked the door, motioning for her to step inside. Nina paused for a moment, looking at him directly. "You still have a choice," she said quietly, her eyes locked on his. "You don't have to go along with this." Blake looked down, his shoulders slumping. He muttered something under his breath, too soft for Nina to hear, before shutting the cell door behind her and walking away. Nina sat on the small, cold bench inside the cell, taking a deep breath. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew she had to stay level-headed if she was going to get out of this situation. Panic wouldn't help her now. The hours dragged on as Nina sat there alone with her thoughts. Every passing minute only fueled her frustration and anger. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting against the injustice that had led her here in the first place. The blatant racism, the abuse of power, the humiliation. All of it burned in her chest like a fire she couldn't put out. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Nina tensed, wondering who it could be this time. To her surprise, it wasn't Grant who appeared at the door of her cell, but Blake. He looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone else was nearby before quickly unlocking the door. Nina's heart raced as he motioned for her to follow him. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. Blake glanced over his shoulder, his face pale with anxiety. "I'm getting you out of here," he whispered. "But we don't have much time." Nina hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to trust him, but she knew she didn't have any other options. If there was even a small chance that he was genuine, she had to take it. Without another word, she followed Blake out of the cell and down the hallway. They moved quickly through the dimly lit station, avoiding the main areas where other officers might be. Nina's heart pounded in her chest as they reached the back exit. Blake paused, pulling out a set of keys and unlocking the door. "This is your chance," he said quietly, looking at her with a mix of fear and resolve. "Get out of here before Grant catches on." Nina's mind was spinning. Could she really trust him? Or was this some kind of trap? But she didn't have time to think it through. Blake had always looked up to Officer Grant, but not because he respected him. It was out of fear. From the day Blake joined the force, Grant had been there, a looming figure who commanded respect through intimidation rather than integrity. Grant's reputation was well known in the precinct. He was the cop you didn't cross, the one who knew how to make problems disappear. And Blake had seen firsthand what happened to those who challenged him. Careers were ruined, reputations destroyed. No one in the department wanted to be on Grant's bad side. Blake had kept his head down, following orders, even when they felt wrong. He told himself it wasn't his place to question a senior officer. But the truth was, he didn't have the courage to stand up to Grant. He wasn't brave enough to risk everything. Until now. As Nina sat in the interrogation room, her wrists cuffed and her face a mask of calm defiance, Blake felt a strange sense of guilt creeping over him. He had heard Nina's story, an FBI agent, arrested for no reason. He had seen the way Grant treated her, the way he sneered at her authority. Blake knew this wasn't right. He knew it in his gut. When he was ordered to process Nina, Blake hesitated, his hand trembling as he held the notepad. Nina's eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked on his, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. Her calm demeanor, even in the face of such blatant injustice, stirred something in him. A sense of duty that he hadn't felt in years. "You already know who I am," Nina said, her voice steady. "You know this isn't right." Blake swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the door. He knew Grant was just outside, waiting for him to fall in line. But Nina's words cut through his fear. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter, and Blake couldn't ignore the fact that he was on the wrong side of this. "I don't make the rules," Blake muttered, avoiding her gaze. Nina leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but commanding. "You may not make the rules, but you have a choice. You don't have to follow orders that are wrong." Blake froze, his hand hovering over the notepad. For a brief moment, he thought about all the times he'd looked the other way, all the injustices he had ignored because it was easier than standing up. But now, looking into Nina's eyes, he realized he couldn't ignore this one. Not anymore. The cool night air hit Nina's face as she stepped out of the small precinct. Her heart raced, her body tense with the adrenaline of the moment. Officer Blake had done what she never thought he would. He had risked his career to get her out of that cell. But now wasn't the time for reflection. Now was the time to move. They were in the back alley of the police station, the darkness cloaking their movements. Blake was visibly shaken, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "Come on, we have to hurry," he urged, motioning for Nina to follow him down the alleyway. Nina's mind was racing, her instincts kicking into high gear. She scanned the surroundings, making sure no one had spotted them yet. The streetlights flickered in the distance, but this part of town was quiet, almost eerily so. She couldn't help but wonder how long they had before Grant realized she was gone. And when he did, She knew he would come after them with everything he had. "Where are we going?" Nina whispered as they hurried along the alley. Blake glanced over his shoulder nervously. "My car's parked a few blocks down. We'll get out of here, then figure out our next move." Nina nodded, though her mind was still processing the situation. Trusting Blake was a risk, but staying at the station with Grant was a guaranteed disaster. She had to take the chance, even if she wasn't entirely sure about Blake's motives. As they reached the end of the alley, Nina's senses were on high alert. Every sound felt amplified: the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of the wind in the trees, the faint buzz of streetlights overhead. Her training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. She wasn't just facing a criminal, she was facing a system that had turned against her. They darted across a deserted street, sticking to the shadows as they moved toward Blake's car. The tension between them was palpable. Nina could see the conflict written all over Blake's face. He was scared, not just of Grant, but of the repercussions of what he was doing. As they neared his car, Blake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Get in," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. Nina slid into the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the area around them. The station was still in view, and every second felt like it could be their last before Grant discovered her escape. Blake started the engine, the low rumble filling the silence between them as he pulled out onto the empty street. For a few moments they drove in tense silence. The city lights flickered past them as they headed toward the outskirts, leaving the precinct and its dangers behind. But Nina knew better than to relax. Grant wouldn't let this go. He would come after her, and he wouldn't stop until he found her. Finally, Blake spoke, his voice shaky. "I don't know how long we have before Grant realizes you're gone. He's going to come after us." Nina nodded, her mind already working on the next steps. "We need to disappear for a while. I have to contact my team at the FBI, but Grant took my phone. I'll need a burner, something untraceable." Blake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "There's a gas station a few miles up. They should have what you need." Nina glanced at him. "Why are you doing this, Blake? You could lose everything. Your job, your reputation. Why help me now?" Blake's jaw clenched as he stared at the road ahead. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said quietly. "Grant's been abusing his power for years. We've all seen it, but no one's had the guts to stand up to him. When he started going after you, I realized I couldn't just stand by and watch." Nina studied him for a moment, weighing his words. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but she also knew how fear could drive people to act in ways they wouldn't normally. She had no choice but to trust him. For now. As they approached the gas station, Blake pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The place was quiet, a lone clerk visible inside the small convenience store. "I'll wait here," Blake said, his voice tense. "Get what you need, but be quick. We can't stay in one place for too long." Nina nodded, stepping out of the car and heading into the store. The clerk barely glanced up from his magazine as she walked past, her eyes scanning the shelves for what she needed. She grabbed a prepaid phone and a few other essentials, moving quickly. Her heart raced as she approached the counter. Every second felt like an eternity. She could almost feel Grant closing in on her, like a shadow looming over her shoulder. The clerk rang up her items, moving with the slow indifference of someone who didn't realize the urgency of the situation. As soon as the transaction was complete, Nina hurried back to the car, sliding into the passenger seat. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. Blake didn't need to be told twice. He pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the dark, winding roads that led out of the city. They drove in silence for a while, the tension between them thickening with every passing mile. Finally, Nina broke the silence. "I need to call my team. We'll need backup if we're going to take Grant down." Blake nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Are you sure your team will believe you? Grant's got a lot of people in his pocket." Nina's jaw tightened. "They'll believe me. I've got allies, people who know what I'm capable of, but we need to move fast. Grant's not going to give up easily." She pulled out the prepaid phony and dialed a number she had memorized. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Nina?" The voice on the other end was sharp with concern. It was Agent Cooper, one of her closest colleagues at the FBI. "Cooper, it's me," Nina said, her voice low but urgent. "I'm in trouble. Grant's dirty, and he's got me on the run. I need backup." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Nina could hear Cooper taking a deep breath. "All right, calm down. Where are you?" Nina glanced out the window, the dark road stretching endlessly before them. "We're heading out of the city, but I don't know how long we have before Grant catches up." "He's dangerous, Cooper. We need to move fast." Cooper's voice grew serious. "I'll send a team to your location, but you need to stay low. Don't let him find you. If Grant's as dirty as you say, he won't hesitate to come after you." "I know," Nina said, her voice tight. "Just get here as fast as you can." "I will," Cooper promised. "Stay safe, Nina." The line went dead, and Nina hung up the phone, her mind racing with the possibilities of what could happen next. She turned to Blake. "They're sending backup, but we need to stay off the grid until they arrive." Blake nodded, though his face was pale with anxiety. "Where do we go?" Nina thought for a moment, her mind working fast. "We need to find a place to lay low for a few hours, somewhere isolated. Do you know any places outside the city?" Blake frowned, thinking. "There's an old cabin in the woods a few miles from here. It's been abandoned for years. It's not much, but it's out of the way. No one would think to look for us there." "Good," Nina said. "Take us there." The minutes passed like hours as they drove deeper into the countryside. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by the thick darkness of the woods. Every bump in the road, every shadow cast by the trees, sent Nina's senses on high alert. She knew Grant wasn't far behind, and the thought of him catching up with them sent a chill down her spine. Finally, Blake turned off the main road, guiding the car down a narrow dirt path that led into the woods. The cabin came into view, a small, dilapidated structure barely visible through the thick trees. It was secluded, just as Blake had said. The perfect place to hide, at least for now. Blake parked the car a few yards from the cabin, and they both got out, moving quickly toward the entrance. The cabin was old and worn, the wooden door creaking loudly as Blake pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clear no one had been here in years. Nina closed the door behind them, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The cabin was small, with only one room and a few pieces of broken furniture scattered around. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "We should be safe here for a while," Blake said, his voice shaky. "At least until your team arrives." Nina nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her chest. They were safe for now, but she knew Grant wouldn't stop until he found them. And when he did, they had to be ready. The moment Blake unlocked the cell door, Nina's mind was already racing. She knew they had minutes, maybe even seconds, before Grant realized what was happening. Every muscle in her body was tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. As they slipped out of the precinct, she kept her head down, scanning the surroundings for any sign of Grant or his men. Blake led her through a series of narrow back streets, avoiding the main roads as they made their way toward his car. His hands were shaking, and Nina could sense his fear, but she didn't have time to comfort him. Her focus was entirely on survival. "We need to keep moving," Nina whispered as they darted through an alley. "He'll be looking for us." Blake nodded, though his face was pale with anxiety. "I know a place we can hide," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not far from here. A cabin in the woods. It's abandoned, but no one will think to look there." Nina glanced at him, weighing her options. The cabin might be their best shot, but they needed to stay ahead of Grant. If he caught up with them before her team arrived, it would be over. As they reached Blake's car, Nina's heart pounded in her chest. The city streets were quiet, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Grant would be on their trail soon, and they needed to disappear. Fast. They drove in silence, the tension between them growing with every passing mile. Nina kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of pursuit. Her mind raced through the possibilities. What would happen if they were caught? How she could fight back if it came to that. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about the job. This was personal. As they neared the cabin, Blake slowed the car, pulling off the main road and onto a dirt path. The headlights illuminated the dense trees surrounding them, casting eerie shadows that danced in the night. "We'll be safe here," Blake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "At least for a little while." Nina didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the cabin ahead. They might be safe for now, but Grant wasn't the type to give up easily. He would come for them, and when he did, they had to be ready. The darkness outside the cabin was thick, and the silence felt oppressive. Nina stood by the window, peering through the cracked, dusty glass into the surrounding woods. Her breath was steady, but her mind raced. She knew Grant. He was a predator. And once he set his sights on something, he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And right now, what he wanted was her. Blake sat on the edge of a broken chair, his hands trembling as he rubbed them together. The fear on his face was unmistakable, and though he was trying to stay calm, it was clear that the weight of his actions was starting to bear down on him. "We're safe here for now," he whispered, though Nina wasn't sure if he was saying it for her benefit or his own. She didn't respond, her eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. Grant had already proven that he wasn't afraid to break the rules. He had humiliated her, abused his power, and now he was hunting her down like she was some kind of fugitive. But Nina wasn't going to let him win. She had faced more dangerous situations in her career, and she wasn't about to let a dirty cop take her down. Suddenly, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Nina tensed, her heart racing as she turned away from the window. "Blake!" she whispered sharply. "Do you hear that?" Blake's face went pale, his eyes widening in fear. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He's here." Nina moved quickly, motioning for Blakey to get up. "We need to move," she said, her voice firm but quick. "He's not going to stop until he finds us." Blake stood up, his hands shaking as he reached for the door, but Nina grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait," she said. "We need to be smart about this. If we run blindly, he'll catch us. We have to be careful." Blake nodded, his face pale with anxiety, but he trusted Nina's judgment. She was the experienced one here, the one who had handled situations like this before. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. The sound of the engine grew louder, and soon, the unmistakable glare of headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. Nina's pulse quickened as she crouched down, pulling Blake with her behind a dusty, tattered curtain. "Stay quiet," she whispered, "and don't move." The headlights stopped, and the engine shut off. For a few agonizing moments, there was nothing but silence. Then came the sound of a car door slamming shut, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the gravel. Nina's breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear every sound, every movement. Grant was close, too close. She could feel the tension building inside her, her instincts telling her to run, but she held back. Now wasn't the time. Grant's footsteps grew louder as he approached the cabin. Nina could hear the faint clink of metal, likely the baton he had used to threaten her earlier. He was taking his time, savoring the chase. This wasn't just about arresting her anymore. This was personal. Come out, wherever you are," Grant's voice taunted from outside, his tone dripping with cruelty. "You really think you can run from me, Agent Harris?" Nina clenched her jaw, her eyes narrowing as she stayed hidden. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a response. He could taunt her all he wanted. She wasn't going to play his game. "You think you're so special, don't you?" Grant continued, his voice loud and mocking. "You think just because you're an FBI agent you're untouchable? Well, guess what? Not out here. Out here, no one cares who you are. The footsteps moved closer to the door. Nina's heart raced as she glanced at Blake, who was frozen in fear. She needed to get them both out of this situation, but they were running out of time. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning under the weight of the tension in the air. Nina tensed, her muscles coiling like a spring, ready to move at a moment's notice. Grant's silhouette filled the doorway, his large frame blocking the faint moonlight from outside. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the dust and decay. "I know you're in here, Nina," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You can't hide forever." Nina stayed perfectly still, her mind racing. She had to think of something, anything, to get them out of this situation. Her gun was still in her holster, but using it now would only escalate things further. If she could find a way to outsmart Grant, to make him lower his guard, she might be able to slip away. Grant took a few steps into the cabin, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. He walked slowly, methodically, as if he were savoring every second of the chase. His flashlight beam flickered across the room, sweeping over the broken furniture and dusty walls. "I know you think you're smarter than me," Grant said, his voice laced with venom. "But out here, it doesn't matter how smart you are. Out here, it's about who's willing to do what it takes to survive." Nina's grip tightened on the edge of the curtain. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. She had dealt with worse men than Grant, men who were far more dangerous and far more ruthless. But the difference was, those men didn't have the power of the law backing them. Grant stopped in the center of the room, his flashlight sweeping over the far wall. "You know," he said, his voice almost casual, "I could have let you off with a warning. I could have pretended like I didn't see you speeding, but you—" His voice grew cold. "You had to make it difficult. You had to challenge me." Nina's blood boiled at his words. This wasn't about her challenging him. This was about his ego, his need to control, his hatred for anyone who dared to stand up to him. But she had to stay calm. She had to think of a way out. Suddenly, Grant's flashlight beam landed on the curtain where Nina and Blake were hiding. Nina's heart stopped as she realized they were about to be discovered. She had to act fast. In a split second, Nina made her move. She grabbed Blake by the arm, pulling him with her as she darted out from behind the curtain. They moved quickly, silently, slipping through the shadows toward the back of the cabin. But Grant wasn't fooled. "I see you," Grant shouted, his voice filled with rage as he turned toward them. "You're not getting away this time." Nina didn't hesitate. She pushed Blake ahead of her, urging him to move faster. "Go!" she hissed, her voice low but urgent. "We need to get out of here now." They burst through the back door of the cabin, the cool night air hitting their faces as they sprinted toward the trees. The forest was dense, the branches clawing at their clothes as they ran, but Nina didn't stop. She could hear Grant behind them, his footsteps pounding against the ground as he gave chase. "You can't run forever, Nina," Grant shouted from behind them, his voice echoing through the trees. Nina's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't afford to slow down. Grant was relentless, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he had them both in cuffs, or worse. They weaved through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves on the ground. The darkness pressed in around them, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But Nina didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance between them and Grant as possible. Blake stumbled ahead of her, his breathing labored and ragged. He was exhausted, and Nina knew he couldn't keep up the pace for much longer. She slowed down just enough to grab his arm, steadying him as they continued to run. "Come on, Blake," she urged, her voice breathless but firm. "You can do this, just a little farther." Blake nodded weakly, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. He was clearly out of his element, but Nina couldn't afford to let him give up. They had to keep moving. Behind them, Grant's voice rang out again, closer this time. "You think you can hide in these woods? I'll find you, Nina. You can't escape me." Nina's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to stop and face him. But she needed to find an advantage, something she could use to turn the tables. Suddenly, Nina spotted a thick patch of underbrush up ahead, partially obscuring a rocky outcrop. It wasn't much, but it could give them a place to hide, at least temporarily. "Over there," she whispered, pulling Blake toward the outcrop. "We can hide behind the rocks. Maybe we can lose him." They crouched down behind the rocks, their breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Nina's pulse raced as she listened for Grant's footsteps. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. For a few moments, everything was still. Nina held her breath, her body tense as she waited for any sign of Grant. Had they lost him? Or was he waiting, just as they were? Then the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush toward them. Nina's heart sank as she realized Grant was close. Too close. They had nowhere left to run. Grant's footsteps echoed through the trees, slow and deliberate, as if he was savoring the chase. Nina crouched behind the rocks, her breath shallow and her heart racing. She could feel Blake trembling beside her, but she kept her focus sharp. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Grant was close, and one wrong move could cost them everything. "Come out, Nina," Grant's voice called through the darkness, dripping with malice. "You really think you can hide from me? You're not getting away." Nina's mind raced, calculating her options. She had the advantage of the dark forest, but Grant knew the area better than she did. He had likely patrolled these woods for years. But Nina wasn't just any target. She was trained for situations like this. She could outthink him. As Grant's footsteps grew closer, Nina signaled to Blake to move farther back into the shadows. They needed to stay low, stay hidden. If they could get just a little more distance, they might be able to slip away. "Do you know why I'm going to win?" Grant's voice taunted again, the flashlight beam cutting through the trees. "Because I know people like you. You think you're better than everyone else. You think your badge protects you. But out here, no one cares about your badge." Nina's pulse quickened, but she didn't let his words shake her. This wasn't just a chase for Grant, it was about control. He had lost control when Nina escaped, and now he was trying to assert his dominance, to prove that he was still in charge. But Nina wasn't going to let him win. As the flashlight beam flickered dangerously close to their hiding spot, Nina made a split-second decision. She motioned for Blake to move, and together, they slipped farther into the woods, weaving through the trees as quietly as possible. The ground was uneven, the underbrush thick, but Nina kept her pace steady, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of Grant. Behind them, Grant's frustration was palpable. He was losing his grip on the situation, and Nina could hear it in his voice. "You can run, Nina, but you can't hide forever," he shouted, his voice growing louder. "I'll find you." Nina's mind raced, formulating a plan. She knew she couldn't keep running forever. At some point, she would have to face Grant head-on. But for now, she needed to stay one step ahead of him. The forest was eerily quiet, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Nina crouched behind the rocks, her breath shallow and quick, as she listened to the slow, deliberate footsteps of Officer Grant drawing closer. The sound of leaves crunching under his boots sent a chill down her spine. They were out of time. He was going to find them. Blake was beside her, trembling, his face pale with fear. His breathing was ragged, and Nina could tell that he was close to breaking. She placed a steadying hand on his arm, trying to calm him. But the truth was, she didn't feel calm herself. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment she would have to face Grant head-on, and there was no telling how it would end. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay low, and let me handle this." Blake nodded weakly, his eyes filled with fear. He trusted her, but that trust felt like a heavy burden. Nina wasn't sure how she was going to get them out of this. Grant wasn't just any cop, he was relentless, driven by a twisted need for control and dominance. and now he was coming for her. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Nina's heart pounded in her chest as she drew her weapon from its holster, keeping it low and out of sight. She didn't want to use it, but if it came down to it, she was prepared to defend herself. Suddenly, the beam of a flashlight cut through the trees, sweeping across the underbrush. Nina tensed, her muscles coiling like a spring as the light passed dangerously close to where they were hiding. She could see Grant's silhouette moving through the darkness, his heavy frame casting long shadows against the trees. "I know you're out here, Nina," Grant called out, his voice taunting, mocking. "Come on, let's end this. You're not going to get away." Nina's grip tightened on her gun. She had faced down dangerous criminals before, but this was different. Grant wasn't just a criminal. He was a man who was supposed to uphold the law, but instead, he had twisted it for his own gain. He had humiliated her, abused his authority, and now he was coming after her like a predator stalking its prey. "I know what you're thinking," Grant continued, his voice closer now. "You think you're going to get away, but you won't. This is my town, my rules. You're just another piece of dirt under my boots." Nina felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had dealt with men like Grant before, men who thought their power made them untouchable, who believed they could treat others as lesser. But she wasn't going to let him win, not this time. With a deep breath, Nina stood up from behind the rocks, her gun at her side, hidden in the shadows. She stepped forward, her body tense but steady, her eyes locked on Grant as he turned toward her, his flashlight beam landing squarely on her face. "There you are," Grant said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I was wondering when you'd show yourself." Nina's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm, controlled. "It's over, Grant," she said, her words deliberate. "Put down the flashlight and we can talk." Grant laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the trees. "Talk? You think I'm here to talk, Agent Harris? No, I'm here to finish this." He took a step toward her, his hand reaching for his baton, the same one he had used to threaten her earlier. Nina's grip tightened on her gun, but she didn't raise it. Not yet. She had to stay calm, had to think clearly. One wrong move, and this situation could spiral out of control. "Let me explain something to you," Grant said, his voice low and menacing. "You might think you're untouchable because of that badge, but out here, it means nothing. I make the rules, and you're just another problem I have to deal with." Nina's jaw clenched, the anger building inside her. But she kept her composure. She had been through too much to let a man like Grant break her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "You don't make the rules, and you don't get to decide who's untouchable. This ends now." Grant's eyes narrowed, his face twisting with rage. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he spat. "I run this town, and no one tells me what to do." Before Nina could respond, Grant lunged at her, swinging the baton with full force. But she was ready. In one swift motion, she sidestepped his attack, her reflexes kicking in as she raised her gun, pointing it directly at him. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. "Drop the baton, Grant, now!" Grant froze, his chest heaving as he stared at the gun in her hands. For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a brief flash of fear. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a sneer of defiance. "You're not going to shoot me," Grant said, his voice low and taunting. "You don't have it in you." Nina's hands were steady, her finger resting on the trigger, but she didn't pull it. She didn't want this to end in violence, but she wasn't going to let Grant intimidate her either. "Drop the baton," she repeated, her voice firm. "I won't ask again." Grant's sneer deepened, but he didn't move. His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Nina's pulse pounded in her ears, but her focus remained razor sharp. "I don't think so," Grant said, his voice cold. "You're not in control here. I am." Without warning, Grant swung the baton again, aiming for her head. Nina reacted instinctively, ducking just in time to avoid the blow. She rolled to the side, her body moving fluidly as she came up in a crouch, her gun still trained on him. "Last chance, Grant," she said, her voice low but dangerous. "Put the baton down, or I will shoot." Grant's face twisted with rage, his chest heaving with each breath. He looked at her, then at the baton in his hand, as if weighing his options. For a moment, it seemed like he might comply. But then his eyes darkened, and he lunged at her again, his hand swinging toward her with all his strength. Nina didn't hesitate this time. She fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the trees, loud and final. Grant's body jerked backward, the baton slipping from his grasp as he stumbled, his face twisted in shock. He dropped to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief as he clutched his side where the bullet had hit him. Nina stood over him, her gun still raised, her heart pounding in her chest. She had aimed for his side, non-lethal, but enough to stop him, enough to end this. "You should have listened," Nina said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "It didn't have to end like this." Grant's breathing was labored, his face pale as he looked up at her. You shot me," he gasped, his voice weak. Nina lowered her gun, keeping her eyes on him. "You gave me no choice." For a moment there was silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension. Then, the sound of distant sirens broke through the stillness, growing louder with each passing second. Nina's backup was finally on the way. Grant slumped against the ground, his strength fading. He wasn't dead, but he was beaten. The fight was over. Blake emerged from the trees, his face pale as he stared at the scene before him. Is it over?" he asked, his voice trembling. Nina nodded, her eyes still on Grant. "It's over." The sirens grew louder, and soon the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness. Backup had arrived, just in time to see the aftermath of what had been a battle for survival. Nina holstered her gun, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival. Grant had pushed her to the edge, and in the end, he had paid the price. As the officers approached, Nina stepped back, allowing them to take over. They cuffed Grant, who was still clutching his side, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. He had thought he was untouchable, but now he would face the consequences of his actions. Nina let out a long breath, the weight of the night's events finally settling in. She had done what she had to do, but the fight wasn't over yet. There would be investigations, reports, and likely fallout from what had happened. But for now at least, she had stopped Grant from doing any more harm. As the paramedics arrived to tend to Grant's wounds, Nina turned to Blake. He looked shaken, but there was a sense of relief in his eyes. "You did the right thing," Blake said quietly. "You stopped him." Nina nodded, though her mind was still racing with the events of the night. "I had no choice," she said softly. Blake looked at her with admiration, but also with understanding. "I don't think I could have done what you did." Nina met his gaze, her expression serious. "You already did. You stood up when no one else would." Blake smiled weakly, but there was a sense of pride in his eyes. He had helped her, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward confronting the corruption he had once been too afraid to challenge. As the officers led Grant away, Nina stood there, watching the flashing lights fade into the night. The danger was over, but the fight for justice had only just begun. The moment Grant's flashlight beam landed on her, Nina knew it was time. She stood up slowly, her gun still at her side, hidden in the shadows. She had been preparing for this moment since the night began, the moment when she would have to confront him, not just as a cop, but as a man who had abused his power for too long. Grant's eyes narrowed as he saw her, his face twisted into a sneer. "There you are," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Thought you could get away, did you?" Nina didn't respond immediately, her eyes locked on Grant's. She could see the anger in his eyes, the frustration of being outwitted, outplayed. But she also saw something else, a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in his confidence. "It's over, Grant," Nina said, her voice steady but firm. "Put the baton down. We can end this now." Grant laughed, a bitter, harsh sound. "You think I'm going to just walk away? You think you can beat me?" Nina's grip tightened on her gun, but she didn't raise it. Not yet. She wanted to give him one last chance to surrender, to stop this before it went any further. But as Grant's hand moved toward his baton, she knew what was coming. He lunged at her, swinging with all his strength, but Nina was ready. She ducked, rolling to the side as his baton missed her by inches. She came up in a crouch, her gun now raised, her sights trained on him. "Last chance, Grant," she said, her voice sharp. "Put it down." Grant's face twisted with rage. "You don't have the guts to shoot me!" he spat. Nina didn't hesitate. The moment Grant lunged again, she fired, the bullet hitting him in the side. Grant staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he clutched his wound. The fight was over. The flashing lights of the police cars faded into the distance as the officers escorted Officer Grant away. Nina stood still, watching the scene unfold, her mind racing with the events of the night. The weight of it all, being humiliated, hunted, and forced into a deadly confrontation, settled heavily on her shoulders. She had done what was necessary to survive, but it didn't feel like a victory. The forest was quiet now, the thick tension in the air gradually dissipating. Nina let out a slow breath, her body still buzzing from the adrenaline, but now exhaustion was starting to set in. She turned to Blake, who was standing by her side, visibly shaken, but alive. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been all night. Blake nodded, though his eyes were still wide with disbelief. I think so," he stammered. "I can't believe it's over." Nina gave him a small nod. "It's over for now," she said, "but there's still a lot to do. This isn't the end." Blake looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Nina's gaze shifted back to where the officers had taken Grant. "We may have stopped him tonight, but there's going to be fallout from this. Investigations, trials. Grant has a lot of connections, and he's not going to go down without a fight." Blake swallowed hard, the weight of what she was saying sinking in. "So, what happens now?" Nina looked at him, her expression determined. "Now, we fight back. We make sure that everything he's done comes to light. This isn't just about what happened tonight. This is about every person he's ever hurt, every abuse of power that's gone unchecked. Grant has to be held accountable for all of it." Blake seemed to absorb her words, nodding slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice more resolute. "He's hurt a lot of people. But I don't know if the department will let him go down so easily. He's got friends in high places." Nina nodded. "I know. But that's where we come in. We have to build the case against him. And we will." Blake looked at her with newfound respect. He had seen her in action, seen her stand up to Grant when no one else had the courage. She was the real deal, and he was grateful to have been on her side. As they stood in the stillness of the forest, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Nina turned to see Agent Cooper walking toward them, his face grim but relieved to see her. "Nina," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Nina nodded, though the exhaustion was clear in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "But we need to talk. There's a lot you need to know." Cooper glanced at Blake, then back at Nina. "I heard about what happened. Grant's been arrested, but it's not going to be easy to bring him down. He's been operating under the radar for a long time." Nina crossed her arms, her expression serious. "I know. But we have evidence. We have witnesses. And we're going to take him down, no matter what it takes." Cooper's eyes softened. "You did good, Nina. You handled yourself like a pro out there." Nina shook her head slightly. "This wasn't about me," she said. "This was about standing up for what's right. Grant has been abusing his power for years, and no one's held him accountable. That changes now." Cooper nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "We'll back you up. The FBI is on this now, and we're going to make sure Grant doesn't slip through the cracks." Blake, still standing beside them, listened quietly. He had seen firsthand how corrupt the system could be, but now, with the FBI involved, there was a sliver of hope that things might actually change. We have to start by going through everything Grant has done, Nina continued. Every case he's worked on, every complaint that's been filed against him. There has to be a paper trail, something we can use to bring him down. Cooper nodded. I'll get a team on it. We'll dig into his records, interview witnesses, whatever it takes. But Nina, you should know that this is going to be a long, hard fight. Grant has allies, and they're going to push back. Nina's eyes hardened. Let them push. I'm ready. As Cooper nodded and turned to give orders to the other agents, Nina felt a sense of determination settle over her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the system, about every person who had ever been mistreated by someone in power like Grant. She had to see this through. The night had taken its toll on her, but she wasn't done yet. There was still work to do. A few days later, the media had caught wind of the arrest of Officer Grant. News outlets ran headlines about the corruption scandal in the police department, about how a respected FBI agent had been wrongly arrested and hunted by one of their own. The story spread like wildfire, and suddenly, the world was watching. Nina sat in her office at the FBI headquarters, scrolling through the news on her phone. The public outrage was palpable. People were demanding answers, demanding justice for the victims of Grant's abuse of power. Cooper knocked lightly on her door before stepping in. "You're all over the news," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Not exactly how you wanted to get famous, I bet." Nina sighed, setting her phone down. "I didn't do this for the attention," she said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Cooper nodded. "I know. And now we have a real shot at taking him down. The department's already launching an internal investigation. It looks like this is going to blow up in Grant's face." Nina gave a small nod, though she knew it was too early to celebrate. "We'll see. He's slippery. He'll try to twist this in his favor." Cooper sat down across from her. "Maybe. But he's not going to get away with this. Not this time." Nina looked out the window, the city skyline stretching out before her. "I hope you're right." In the days that followed, Nina worked tirelessly with the FBI team to gather evidence against Grant. They interviewed former colleagues, combed through old case files, and pieced together a timeline of his corruption. Every new piece of information painted a clearer picture of just how deep his abuse of power ran. Blake was instrumental in helping them connect the dots. Though he had been nervous at first, he was now fully committed to bringing Grant down. He testified about the countless times he had witnessed Grant's misconduct, about the fear that had kept him silent for so long. Nina admired his courage. It wasn't easy to stand up against someone like Grant, especially when the system had been protecting him for so long. But together, they were making progress. Weeks later, the trial finally began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, and the air was thick with anticipation. Grant sat at the defendant's table, his face twisted into a mask of defiance. He looked smaller now, stripped of his authority and control, but even now, he refused to admit any wrongdoing. Nina sat in the front row, watching as witness after witness testified against him. Victims, fellow officers, even some of his former friends. All of them had stories about the way Grant had manipulated the system for his own gain. But it wasn't until Blake took the stand that the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. His testimony was clear and damning. He spoke about how Grant had abused his position, about the fear that had kept so many people silent. He spoke about the night he had helped Nina escape, about how he had finally decided that enough was enough. When the trial ended, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Grant was found guilty on multiple counts of corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to a long prison term, his career and reputation in ruins. As the verdict was read, Nina felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Justice had been served. Grant was finally being held accountable for everything he had done. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed around Nina as she walked down the steps. They bombarded her with questions, but she kept her responses brief, focused. This wasn't about her. It was about the victims, about the system that had allowed someone like Grant to thrive for so long. One reporter pushed through the crowd, asking, "Agent Harris, what's next for you after all of this?" Nina paused for a moment, her gaze steady. "What's next? We keep fighting," she said simply. "There's still work to be done." With that, she walked away from the courthouse, leaving the chaos of the press behind. The battle against corruption wasn't over, but for now, Nina had won, and she would keep fighting for as long as it took. The trial of Officer Grant became a national sensation. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had once been untouchable, now standing on trial for his crimes. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation, as witness after witness took the stand, detailing the years of abuse, corruption, and intimidation that had allowed Grant to operate unchecked. Nina sat in the front row, her expression calm but resolute. She had prepared herself for this moment, knowing that Grant's defense team would try to paint her as the aggressor, that they would twist the truth to protect their client. But the evidence against Grant was overwhelming, and each testimony only solidified the case against him. Blake's testimony was one of the most powerful. Standing before the courtroom, he spoke openly about the fear that had kept him silent for so long, about the moment when he realized he couldn't look the other way anymore. His voice trembled at times, but his conviction was clear. He had seen the truth, and he was ready to face the consequences of standing up to Grant. The media swarmed Nina outside the courthouse after the verdict was read. Grant had been found guilty on all charges, sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The system had worked, but Nina knew this was just the beginning. There were others like Grant, others who had used their power to hurt people, and she wasn't going to stop until they were held accountable. A reporter pushed through the crowd, shouting, "Agent Harris, what's next for you?" Nina paused, her eyes steady as she looked at the sea of cameras and microphones before her. "What's next? We keep fighting. This is just the beginning." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the chaos behind. The fight wasn't over, but tonight, justice had been served.